We've got 45 minutes, and this topic, the reason I chose to do this with Jennifer is because every time I talk to a CISO, one of the biggest challenges, to include even our CISO, Tim Crothers, who I call out in every meeting now, apparently, who's not in this one, this is one of our top challenges, is how to secure our supply chain. And the best company at helping you identify who's in your supply chain and what that risk is Interos. And it's an overnight sensation, right, Jennifer? Is that how you describe it after?
18 years.
Overnight, just like that. Isn't that amazing? Only 18 years to get here to this moment right now.
I will tell you a true story.
Oh, good. Can you add 5% fiction to it?
Okay, just a little bit. It'll make it more interesting. Nice. First 5 years in business, one of the big guys actually took me for drinks, and he's like, really? You're going to bank your whole career and your whole company on this thing called supply chain risk? And I said, yes. And 18 years later, we looked like we were really smart. It took a while.
Well, we could swap that story. I remember saying when I started my company, security breaches are inevitable, and there was like no believers in that premise, so I had to change that. But you did better.
You did okay, I think.
Still
I just read something.
Still trying to carve my way. Still trying to carve my way.
I know, Mom said she's very proud of you.
She did. That's easy to please your mother, apparently. So tell the crowd, a lot of folks may not have heard of your company before.
After 18 years.
After 18 years, you've never heard of it. So could you please just tell us, so what do you guys do?
So what we do is we map and monitor the global supply chain. And if you think about the last 3 years of all of our lives, a lot of the ramifications of the supply chain we have felt, whether it be from a professional standpoint, from a consumer standpoint, whether you're trying to access different systems online and you can't access them because of SolarWinds or what have you, or if you're just going to the local store and you're going to buy your brand of baby formula. And so if you think about the global supply chain, we realize that a couple things. One is we are just hyper-connected as a global economy. So we're sourcing products and services from people and companies around the world that we just didn't have any idea about. And when something goes bump in the night, so a ship goes sideways, there's a cyber breach, whether accidental or nefarious, or Russia invades Ukraine, there's some sort of interruption and there's a knock-on effect. And so my personal background is longtime logistician, really just was there in the 90s when we started offshoring manufacturing to companies and countries around the world, and we just didn't realize if it was a good or a bad idea. And so built a technology company that does that. We map and monitor the global supply chain, so when things do go bump in the night, the idea is to allow you to preempt that disruption so you don't feel it.
So one of the neat parts of my job is somehow my cell number gets in the hands of people, and then they call me and I answer, and they're like, we're such and such company, and I'll be like, I've never heard of you. And they're like, yeah, but if we're not back up and online soon, not one train's gonna deliver one good for the next 3 weeks. And in true story, there's a lot of little companies out there that if they fail, whether it be ransomware attack or earthquake or some other natural disaster, things start to grind to a halt. And what's funny is I'm trying to remember 2 examples that are real, and I can't even remember the names of the companies today because they're just, you never hear of them. You don't see their commercials during a Super Bowl. They're just out there. And so I'd ask you, you probably can't say the company name, but do you have any examples of lack of awareness of supply chain shocking a company and kind of grinding them to a halt where they're like, wait, we didn't know that even existed?
Well, so I can actually tell you a couple public ones, because they've been in the paper. But think about when the unfortunate situation with Russia moving into Ukraine. I was on Bloomberg. I was overseas when it happened, and we were actually in Rolls-Royce's headquarters for their civil organization, and they were flying people into Russia because of titanium problems. And so you had a massive push because you had about 40-some% of the world's titanium came from one place in the world. And at the same time, we had 300 companies reach out to us in the first 5 business days after the invasion, 300, because most organizations know who they're directly buying from. They have no idea who's in the tier 2 or tier 3 from a proximity. And that's what we were able to provide. And so it's been a really interesting, last few years with really, and I talk about all the time, like the world got educated. And so, and my mother actually knows what I do for a living now because she would go to the store and couldn't buy whatever she couldn't buy because of, the halts in the supply chain. But I think, the one that comes to mind that's the easiest was titanium. Interestingly enough, I was actually at another event with you and presenting about aerospace and defense and the problems that they were having in the global supply chain, titanium just one piece of it. And I remember a gentleman came up to me afterwards and he's like, you were talking about aerospace and defense and I started to tune out and then I heard you say titanium. And here he's in healthcare and the needle in needles is titanium. And so he literally left this presentation and made some phone calls because he's like, I have no idea if I'm going to be able to continue to satisfy my customers because Rolls-Royce and Airbus and all these other companies are going and buying the world's titanium as fast as they possibly can. And so that's the type of stuff that happened. And that was just one example of what happened in the world.
Fascinating that titanium is more interesting to that person than defense. But now we all know, by the way, investment tip. Invest in titanium. Sounds like a good hint. So there's a lot of folks here, and I have the same, like once a year I have to tell myself, hey, I own risk for the company, so what do I do about supply chain risk? Well, how would you, if somebody sits down with you, hey, Jennifer, I own risk for my company, what should I do to manage my supply chain risk? How do you step them through it? What's the process?
Yeah, the first thing is to start asking the question. It's to get really, really curious. And also, you hear this a lot, you don't want to over-engineer it. I think one of the biggest changes over the so many years has been companies really redesigning what is critical to them from a business standpoint. So years ago, if I asked you, well, first of all, years ago, and maybe 4 or 5 years ago, the conversation was not getting outside of the warehouses and the trucks because that's what everybody thought supply chain was. Now, most of the people I talk to are CEOs of global organizations. I think that's the first thing that's really changed. So the great part about it, to answer your question, is that this is a very easy conversation to have. The boards are getting very curious. It was cybersecurity. Now it's also, who's in our supply chain, and because it's actually hitting organizations' bottom line, it's their profitability, it's brand and reputation. So I think the first thing is to really start asking those questions at the highest level. This is a C-suite conversation because it is brand and reputation. The second is really just getting started. And so don't worry, did you actually figure out who's critical and who's going to have the biggest impact to your business? It's really having a process and figuring out where you are on that maturity curve. And it can be as simple as, when I started this, everybody, and still a lot of organizations, do this on Excel spreadsheets, or they do it contractually once a year and then check in next year, hey, did anything change with you, Mr. Supplier or business partner? And so I think it's getting curious. The one thing that is interesting, in addition to the conversation moving to the C-suite, we've done some surveys over the last few years, and repeatedly we're hearing about the increased investment from a technology standpoint. And I think that that's really very interesting to me, is that right now, only about 10% of organizations we talk to actually understand who their fourth and fifth party is, right? So your third party is who you buy from directly, your fourth is who they buy from, and your fifth is two hops away. Only 10% of the organizations we talk to have any idea who the fourth and the fifth are. And the only way to do that is, historically, it was through surveys, which take time. People don't really answer them. They don't return them. The better way is technology. North of 80% of the companies we're talking to have budgeted to implement technology to map and monitor supply chains over the next 12 months. And I think that's when you ask how do I get started? First is to get curious. Second is to make sure you have the cultural shift at the C-suite level. And the third is to invest in technology.
Well, and that's great advice. And a company I'm close to, but won't say the name of because this is streaming, what they did is they went to all their business line owners to say, hey, who do we rely on and depend on? And got a very small list of their suppliers, and it was only the secondary ones, like the direct suppliers. So then that CEO may or may not have walked down the hall to the CFO and said, who are we paying? Because I know we depend on more than 15 companies. And then we're paying over 2,000 companies annually to do something for us. But we never went, we being whoever this fictional company is, never went to figure out who's the tertiary and the next one down. what makes Interos unique to mapping that third level and fourth level relationships? And I'm going to say it because you never get the opportunity to say tertiary. And then I also want to know what comes after tertiary, quadriary. But we'll sort that out before the end of this. One of you, if you can Google on your phone what comes after tertiary, that will be a great takeaway. But how do you guys do it? What's your IP? Because to me, that is magic, connecting all those dots behind the directs. And by the way, 10% was higher than I expected. Because if I go in and say, who do you depend on in your entirety, most people have not mapped their suppliers' supply chain, period. It just stops at the direct suppliers. So how do you do it?
Did you just really ask me to disclose my intellectual property on?
Damn straight I did. And then we're all gonna, that's our second investment in ourselves to go do that. No.
So,
Well, I mean, but you answer the mail, right? I mean,
Yes.
bottom line is this. We figure out in the entire ecosystem by relying on your technology.
Yeah. So, so to answer the question is we've done it using big data, right? So years ago, company's 18 years old, we started as a services company, and we ended up taking all of the work we did manually the first 14 years and hand labeling it, and then teaching a machine how to use forensics to create artificial intelligence algorithms. So that's the IP piece. But what we do is we just ingest massive amounts of data. So I saw a statistic years ago, Michael Dell talked about the fact that we actually only accumulate and get value from about 11% of the world's big data, and we're one of the players in that now. So we ingest massive amounts of data, like 3 different buckets. Publicly available, so think about all the news reports that you guys hear, public websites, governmental websites. We subscribe to several different services, partnerships with folks like Mandiant. And then the last is having customers actually bring data to the platform. And so right now we map and monitor about 350 million companies around the world continuously. So we're constantly looking at 350 million companies to see what's happening to them financially, what's happening to them from a sustainability and an ESG situation, which is massive right now. Was looking from a cybersecurity. So mapping and monitoring, and then we're able to, as far away as we have connections, we're able to say, okay, there's a red dot, there's an alert, and let me tell you about it and how far away. And so from a big, hairy, audacious goal of what we're building at Interos, if I can tell you an event happened, so is it a cyber breach? Did China just buy a critical supplier? Did a company or a country invade another country that you need access to? If I can tell you what happened, how far away it happened, and whether you need to take action, that's what we do at Interos.
So have you asked your head of engineering when the release date is for that? And he said February 11th.
We're building towards that.
No, because it sounds to me like I kind of illustrated the first mistake in supply chain is you stop at the directs, although it's better than nothing. And I love that you said don't get perfect,
Yep.
just get somewhere. Getting just your directs and trying to prioritize them matters. When you go broad like that, do you see you then being the dashboard someday where somebody on your staff, whether it be the threat intel folks or whoever owns risk, seeing the Interos dashboard and saying, oh, 6 steps away, we've got a problem. Can you just click on that then and say, oh, and it's going to impact this, then that, you see the cascade and ripple effect? I'm talking magic, but I just wanted
No, it's not magic, and that's a bit of what we do now.
Yep.
But even more than that, the idea here is that we want every CEO to wake up, and we actually provide an Interos score for the health of your supply chain, so the I score. Right. So like almost like the UL, if you will, of supply chain. That's what we do every day. So we provide companies around the world the health of their global supply chain, so that when that CEO gets up every day, it's red, yellow, or green. They know what kind of good day they're going to have. And to your point, then they can deploy folks that could actually go into the platform and say, okay, here's the problem. Do I need to take an action or not? Because that's really, but that's the power of data. Right, is that you want the data to drive better informed decision making versus having to do a lot of research. And I think that's really what we've been able to do.
Got it. And what would you tell a CEO who's like, okay, Jennifer, I've got my supply chain. I see it. I've got 100 suppliers I care about, some direct, some secondary, tertiary, whatever comes after that. What do I do now? What would you advise them? Is it a contractual relationships with them that you start to alter? What do you do next to kind of manage that risk? Or is it more just you identify and at least you're aware of the updates.
I think the magic of the global supply chain is that it's dynamic.
Got it.
Right? And so it changes minute by minute, because if you think about it and what the importance of the education we received over the last few years is that there are so many companies around the world that you just don't have control over. And I think, you were bringing it before, you have these small companies, you don't even, remember the name, but there was a problem. And so unless you literally owned every company that you did business with, which doesn't really happen in most commercial supply chains. So agriculture might be a little bit different, right? Because sometimes the folks that own the protein actually own the land, the farms, and everything that goes into the soil. Most supply chains, aerospace defense, are just massive. And it's not just the people building the F-35 that we care about. It's every other customer they have, every other partnership they have. And all those things are constantly changing because all those businesses are trying to innovate. They're trying to get better pricing. They're trying to move into different, markets themselves. And so I think to the point that you just asked, the whole idea was we leverage technology and data that presents you when you actually have to do something. So if we show you a red dot, that's when you take action. Other than that, it should just, almost like exception management, it should be just kind of humming in the background.
So let's go forward a couple years. What sort of advancements can we expect to see in supply chain security and understanding the risk in the supply chain? You just mentioned one, the ability to get that red dot dashboard. I'll feed you one, feature creep right now. How cool would it be to say, over time, this supplier has continued to add risk to me, period? Is that something that'll...
So we do that now from a historical standpoint. So right now we're working on trending.
Right.
And so if you're using the past to predict the future, if you will. So we do that today because that's material, right? I mean, the fact, and you would know this better than I would, but people get breached, companies get breached, it just happens, right? And so it's a bit more of what did you do about it versus did it happen to you necessarily, I would think. And so, I actually listened to what you and Phil talked about yesterday, and I made a note, this whole, right now, the sexy term in supply chain is digital twins. So everybody wants to create a digital replication of their supply chain. And the idea, and we're working with organizations about this, is to kind of scenario plan, do what if, right? So I have a red dot. Back to your point, am I really picking suppliers or business partnerships that are actually material and critical to my business or not? And if I make a change, what does that do to the rest? What's the ripple effect? What's that do to the rest of my risk profile or my business? But the idea I think that's interesting is creating more of a digital immune system, which is if I can leverage technology to build something that auto-corrects, that's powerful.
Yeah, so digital twin, I'm on that. I wish my sister was in the room because I don't think we have a digital twin mapping just yet. Darn it. Something to aspire to. We've got a bunch of folks in the room right now. We are going to take questions from the audience. I've got 2 more questions for you, but what I'd like to do right now is go to the audience, and I can bring you a microphone, and we have a mics in the back of the room, and we can take questions from the audience. And by the way, Jennifer, I didn't ask if that's okay. Are you okay with taking questions from the audience?
Except from Todd. Todd's the only one. No, yes.
Yes. I can't see, so if there's anybody with a question, please pick.
Hi, good morning. This is Stephanie here. Regarding the supply chain risks, you are actually providing visibility and potentially also some forecasting and predictability. I think one of the challenge that some of us who manage, entire IT infrastructure is that quite a number of the supplier is not just software. Some of them are actually service provider. It could be managed services provider, or it could be platform as a service and software as a service. And they do this for a living. So it is very hard to map it out behind the software as a service or platform as a service or their managed services, what tools they use, and what they actually do in terms of a number of security protection as well as data protection. So that is actually one of the risks that we have identified, that it is very challenging for us, every time we audit them. Is it audit is the right method, or is there any other mechanism that we can mitigate some of these risks that are associated with software as a service, platform as a service, managed service?
That's a great question. You actually may have a perspective on that one.
My internal dialogue is, as you say, that the bottom line is this. I felt like if you run Interos on all the companies out there, you're going to have Microsoft, AWS, or Google hit all of them as a supplier. And so, I mean, you go right to what's the biggest systemic risk to all our businesses and all our nation's backbone? Those three places. That was my thought. I didn't want to say that while we're streaming because out there, but I now realized if we have adversaries, against your nation or the United States or the Five Eyes, they've already figured that out. They already figured out AWS is a pretty solid target. So is Google Cloud. So is Microsoft.
So I guess the question, though, to the point, I do have a couple thoughts.
Well, that's how I internalized her question. I just went, well, we all depend on probably there's a conjunction where there's 10 to 20 suppliers that supply upwards of 75 to 80% of the companies out there.
I think that, so one, it's a question, I couldn't agree with Kevin more, it's a question that every one of our customers struggles with, is that when we start doing this mapping, they're all like, well, tell me about the other companies I don't know I'm connected to, because these I assume I'm connected to. I will tell you that, and again, from just talking from our perspective, we're outside in, right? So we're looking at all the third parties and fourth parties and fifth parties, what have you, and looking what meets you and your organization. The important part of that, from our perspective, is just how many touch points you have to those organizations. Because if every one of your suppliers goes back to Microsoft or Google or whoever, the amount of the concentration risk is something that you need to be aware of. And that's where the interruptions happen, and that's where the investment in resilience that you need to start thinking about. I look at this a bit of knowledge is power, because it's on one level, we should all assume we're connected to the cloud providers, but on the second level, you need to understand if one of them, when one of them has an impact, whether it just goes down or it actually has some sort of significant breach, what does it interrupt from your organization and where? And so I think that's the first piece. The second piece is having a dialogue. There's nothing, as much as we're a technology company, there is nothing better than the human interaction with you engaging with your service partners, your suppliers of hard goods or software, just to say, hey, we realize how material our relationship is to our business. Therefore, we want to partner, invest with you, not in you, but with you, to ensure that this doesn't get interrupted, or if it does get interrupted, that we share that right away so that we don't lose money, consumers, what have you, brand, reputation harm. And so I don't know if there's really tips and tricks that I would always look. I think there's a lot of these technologies, there's a lot of partnerships and providers. But for the companies that are getting value from mapping out the supply chain, even if we all do go back to the big cloud providers, it's really understanding how concentrated, how reliant you are on any single company, and then what are the protections you're putting in place, because this is where you've decided the interruption will be and what it'll cost.
Hi, my name is Eric. I had a question about kind of sanctions and sanctions evasions. I'm assuming with the ongoing regulatory changes that go on every day and the additions to sanctions lists, do you guys monitor for shell companies, front companies, and other aspects of kind of sanctions evasions? And how does that look like within your system?
It's a great question. We actually coined this term. You probably can't tell, I'm a little Italian, and supply chain washing. So think about money laundering. Right? So the whole idea when the sanctions were levied against Russia, I think there's 3,000 some was the last count I heard. Every time a sanction was published anywhere in the world, within 24 hours it was in our platform. So our customers could see the overlay, could see the interruption, could see where else they needed to go. But you're exactly right. And we started as a government contractor here in the States, and that's where we got to cut our eye teeth on how to identify shell companies and front companies. Or in the situation where you have sanctions, changing export routes, right? To make sure that I could still get product in and out of countries that I shouldn't be dealing with. Those are the exact things that we started looking for, which is why the trending became very, very important. So when I think about our platform, the more that you can manage it via exception management, something suddenly changed, why did it change? Those are the things that make you think about, okay, I need to dig a little bit deeper, which is also why we do look at 6 different risk factors, not because I'm looking for a score, that's a little generic for me, but I'm looking for what does the change in any one of those vectors, as well as the relationships, what does that tell me? And that would tip off that folks are doing supply chain washing.
And Eric, we have found your cover organization.
Uh-oh.
So we have some up front.
Hello, Jennifer. Hello, Kevin. It's like winning the lottery, having both of you on the stage at the same time. My question is, ESG. How should the federal government approach ESG as a supply chain risk management input? And also secondary, is there a specific skill set that you see lacking that the next generation of supply chain professionals should strive for? Thank you.
So, two really good questions. Do you know, it's a really weird thing. The best skill set or training for supply chain risk, do you know this one? I don't know. Go ahead, guess.
I think you know.
Oh, I do, but you want to guess? No?
Oh, guess, X equals 4 2C.
Okay, no. So music majors, because it's all around the relationship. It's all around looking at what came before and what goes after, and understanding, kind of the question that Eric just asked, is I want to understand relationally how things should operate, so when it doesn't operate around it, it makes me uncomfortable and curious, which I thought was really interesting, which is why I remembered that one. Because there's not a lot of schooling for what we do specifically, it's all around the relationship. So I think that the more, and I don't know what specific class this is necessarily, Todd, but I think the more folks just understand how business operates, the economics, I would tell you that that's a large part of it, is really understanding causality. Those are the things that I don't know, benefited me getting here, as well as I think that the folks in our company, the analysts that are really, really strong that work for us, that's the type of background they have. I think from a ESG standpoint, it's a really different world working here in the States than it is over in Europe, because they've taken a stand. So whether it's the German Supply Chain Act that covers modern slavery under ESG, now about to be European, or carbon footprint, right? The states have attacked it a little bit differently and a little bit behind, in my opinion. And so I think the first thing is taking a stand and defining what they care about. And is it, carbon neutral or whatever their policy is? That's the first thing that really needs to have happen. And then they need to invest in it and hold people accountable. If you looked at the German Supply Chain Act, they gave folks 12, 18 months to get ready for it, but they literally said, it's gonna cost you this percentage of your annual revenue if we find out that you are doing something you shouldn't be doing around modern slavery. And oh, by the way, the very first line mandated mapping and monitoring of the global supply chain. And it didn't care if you were headquartered in Germany or just doing business there, we were gonna get all of you. And I think from a state standpoint, that's something that we really need to take a bit more seriously.
And I'll jump on that answer because I thought X equals 4 missed the mark. From my CEO perspective, when I look at the folks who own risk at my company, I never want them to assume that I would accept the risk they would. Period. So whoever you have doing the next gen supply chain risk management at your organization, because I've made it internal, you want to make sure you get the superset of every possible risk, and you love those people that are very, very risk averse. So that superset's huge, and it is the CEO who gets to employ or deploy his own risk tolerance, period. I always get very worried when somebody assumes that the risk they're taking is okay with me. So that's the characteristic I'd look for, a comprehensive, here's the understanding of the risk across the whole supply chain, presented in a way where they could say, we think it's manageable to here, so that I can ask, well, for the, can we accept the risk on the other side of that bar? That's all. Bottom line, I guess that would be creative, curious, and they don't make assumptions.
Oh, first of all, it's quaternary, apparently. I looked that up.
What was that again? I never
It's
knew my whole life.
Quaternary, Q-A-T-E-R.
Quaternary, there's an N.
Yeah, quaternary. Anyway, yeah, we all know there's actually a whole line of them. If you want to know fifth, sixth.
Quaternary, for those streaming, that's the fourth.
My question actually kind of goes along with Stephanie's earlier. We think about supply chain from the perspective of a service provider, or even in many cases, material providers. And these suppliers often have people that are getting access within an organization, right? So we think about having to provide third-party access as part of those relationships with the suppliers. What can be taken away from Interos and what you're doing there, Jennifer, to help affect the identity and access of those suppliers? For example, if you're identifying a breach occurred, or if you're identifying that somebody presents some form of cyber risk, how can that be tied, and what maybe are you guys doing to try to tie that stuff into the identity and access of those suppliers?
Yeah, and I keep looking at you to help out with some of these conversations.
Oh, that's that look? I misread it as, don't answer this, I've got it. Right, sorry.
Well, no, but I think that that's part of some of the partnership that we have with you all as well, is that, from a personal opinion, is that I think technology gets you to a certain place, and I think it's a little bit of what you just said as well, is that technology gets you to a certain place, and then I need to ask additional questions, right? Because I can't trust technology just to flag things. We're not into whitelisting and blacklisting. We're into saying something happened that you need to get curious about. But then I think, to me, when you start getting into people and access and those types of things, there are other tools, or else you deploy resources to figure some of these things out.
Yeah, and that's why it'd be great if my CISO was here, because he'll tell you, we have a tiering system for our supply chain, whether it's software suppliers to they mow the yard outside. And if we share data with them of any kind, they become tier 1, and we have all these different requirements for them. Anyone who accesses our network is going to be tier 1, period. And we should be able to take immediate access on our authoritative identity management system very quickly. So that's all I'd tell you. If there's anyone accessing your network, make them a tier 1 party, and you just know the accounts that are belonging to third parties. And this is not something you get done in a week. If you walk back to your companies and say, so how many identities do we have that are third parties? You may not, hopefully you get an answer that day. I doubt you get it that minute. But if you're a multinational, large organization with many different authoritative sources to identity, you may wait a month. It all depends on where you're at in that journey and whether you can find the right person. Bottom line, anyone who accesses your network, anyone whose access needs to be cut off due to compromise has to be in that upper priority tiering.
Hi, I'm Cheryl Biswas. I do cyber threat intelligence, and I study software supply chain events. I'm curious with regard to Log4Shell, Log4j, and the recent declaration by Department of Homeland Security that it was endemic due to the risk and the prevalence of that vulnerability. How is or how can Interos address that?
Yeah. I'm looking at Kevin.
Why, Jennifer, that was a good question for you. You want me to jump on that?
I would like you.
So first off,
prevalent.
so when you look at software as a supply chain, it's sort of unique because a lot of logistics is trucks pulling up, and when the truck doesn't pull up, everybody gets it. Hey, we're not getting our goods and services from them today. But software is there immediately, faster than the eye can travel. You can't, by the time you hear of Log4j, you can't just run and pop an Ethernet cord out and say, okay, I'm fast enough to be protected. So the bottom line is what we do, again, if we're using your software, you got to tier 1 those folks, because you have to have somebody there that recognizes these are the 10 things we depend on to run our business in software. And if you're big enough, multinational, 1A enterprise organization, you are assessing other people's technology for vulnerabilities. You can black box test it, and you can do it. If you provide software, it's almost like you have the same problem as a vendor. We make software, so we got to make sure our software, we check it at runtime to make sure it's not vulnerable. We check the source code to make sure we're not injecting vulnerabilities, and that's on the vendor side. But as a consumer of software, I just highly recommend, if you're depending on that software based on, and you have to prioritize it based on how much money you make, is it part of your business process? Is it a part of your mission that you're accomplishing at an organization? Is it the data that it manipulates, it's all that critical, whatever it is, all that's probably a tier 1 priority. So if there's issues with that software, you have an inventory of it, you're aware of the patches that you probably have to expedite because it's tier 1 software, but you can't take the human out of it. There is nothing, if somebody knows of this magic software, please let me know. We live this all the time where we find vulnerable software. It's happened 36 times this year, 0 days. When's the patch coming out? Nobody knows. It's like you hear about Patch Tuesday, but could there be a patch available on Wednesday at 6 a.m.? Absolutely. Could it be one Thursday? Yes. Friday? Yes. Apps get patched all the time, and no one's going to be banging down on your security team's door to do it. You have to be alert, aware, and have a threat sharing network where, Log4j, by the way, is a great example of everybody knew about it, in my opinion, even before adversaries were arming the attacks effectively. That was one of the best examples of, at the JCDC and CISA, we all flexed, and I found out about it actually at CISA. We were at a meeting, and all of a sudden, it was December 8th. What's going on with Log4j? What's happening? That's the best you can do. I hate to say it. I don't know of the auto magic that exists that can tell you there's a vulnerable piece of software on your network. Humans have to alert people. That's at least the state of the art today.
Yeah, and I think, to the point that you just said, and that's why I looked at Kevin when you asked the question, what we're able to do at Interos is start flagging folks outside of your organization that you need to categorize, like Kevin just said, or you need to ask these types of questions. Couldn't agree with you more, though. Nothing excuses or is any better than the human element. So once you identify who is critical, where is the pinch point with the extended relationships, these are the types of questions and the conversations you're having.
But it goes beyond just, so here's where software supply chain is a little different than a lot of other things as well, because you don't just deal with companies. You use software that uses publicly available APIs, and who makes sure those are secure. Yep. There's a whole movement in the startup community. Google Cloud's working on this. Google's doing work on this. Microsoft will do work on this, where everybody's trying to make sure you can use dependable and reliable, secure libraries. The challenge we're all going to have is anyone who makes a library or software that other software can use, nobody's really sure what intent other developers have when they use their library. So you always wonder about, can you inject the vulnerability based on how apps work together and have unintended consequences because you didn't see or project how someone would use your software. Long story made short, everybody's trying to secure the supply chain. SolarWinds helped us in software to do it. Log4j, the #1 call we got at Mandiant after Log4j was, are you seeing anybody arm it? And we were seeing people arm it, but it was never as widespread as what we thought it would be. But the second #1 question is, so how do we know if we're using it somewhere? Almost every company's doing a far better job today. 1A Enterprise, yes. Small and mediums, probably no. But 1A Enterprise is mapping all their software dependencies a lot. I think there'll always be bloat and creep there, and there'll always be something you don't know about. But that's something that will change. We're all going to get better at an inventory of all the software we depend on.
Agreed.
Hi, my name is Kimberly LaFortune. Thank you for the conversation today, really good. Obviously, it's important to know what our supply chain involves, but our relationship is also with our direct supplier. Mm-hmm. So based on your experience and your customers, have you seen any of them making any contractual changes to the relationship with them to maybe hold them accountable for their relationships with their suppliers?
Yeah, so absolutely. And I think that was the first movement, and that actually happened before COVID. And through service level agreements or what have you, which is, thou shalt do X. And as more compliance and regulatory things happen and NIST puts out different standards, you'll see a lot more of those things. Cyber actually created a situation where thou shalt tell me when you're breached, right? And, there's some unrealistic things that says, tell me within the first 3 hours, you don't even know what happened to you, or did it happen to you, right? So yes, you're seeing SLAs be flowed down. I think the great news, though, and I do think the pandemic helped with this because we just realized how much help we needed from our supply chain partners, is that it became a lot less litigious. And I actually think that's going to help business because, again, people get breached, things get interrupted. You have rolling blackouts from COVID because countries and companies are going up and down because people are getting sick or what have you. And I think that we've become a little bit more patient in doing business with folks. So yes, do I see SLAs more based on compliance activities versus business interruptions? But that building of trust is really what's happening. I'll also say that from an Interos standpoint, because the government had flowed down to the primes and said, you shall be responsible for X, Y, Z in your supply chain. And then that got flown down. You see a lot more, when I say industry days, our customers were taking information, like reports, if you will, out of our platform and sharing it with their next tier supplier and saying, we gave you an SLA as part of the contract, but we're going to make it better. We're going to show you how we're looking at it, what we're seeing. Is it true? Did you do something about it? Or is this a surprise? And so yes to contracts, and I think that's a natural next step because it at least starts a conversation. The good news is that it's becoming more conversational versus contracts being canceled unless there's really nefarious actions going on.
And so before the last question, is there one more question from the audience? One more right up front.
Thank you. Ms. Bisceglie, Interos exists to compile supply information and provide it to its customers, correct?
So we look at who's doing business with who. So not necessarily supply, but more business relationships. But go
That
ahead.
being the case, your customers depend on your information. So is Interos a target for those who would affect the supply chain by altering your data and creating and fabricating crises and choke points?
In other words, would you be a target?
Yeah. So yes.
Yep. That's why we safeguard her and make sure nothing happens. It comes down to data integrity issues, and it's amazing how many folks have to deal with this. I mean, my company as a vendor, I've lived through the supply chain security ratchet, quite frankly, where I remember the banks used to just send us, here's a one-pager, fill that out. Now they show like 10 bodies, they interview people, they see how are you doing, what are you doing, SOC 2 compliance. They are verifying in person. We've worked for the defense industrial base for years, vetting their suppliers that are critical to their business. So we're all going to be on the lookout for each other on this one because we all depend on each other for our own security. The nice thing about the bigs, and I like how you said it, the bigs are responsible right now for securing the smalls. When you look at what they're doing, they're making it contractual relationships with critical suppliers, arguably so early in the life cycle of those smalls that it's actually hard for them to do it. So that's why the bigs are stepping in and helping resource it. But I can tell you this, if anything ever happens to Interos, and it won't, I'll call you right away. We'll circle the wagons, but it'll be highly visible if anybody hacks and alters data. Which leads me to one last point on that point. I've never seen a modern nation, on my rules of the playground, I've never seen a modern adversary, China, Russia, and Iran, change data yet. It is a rule of the playground that has not been broken yet, and I know of one or two exceptions, but we know of them. And the reason why is nobody wants to live through that yet. So the minute somebody does something like that to Interos, we already have a conflict that has escalated beyond a cyber issue. So my final question for you. So what's next for Interos? 2023, as you look out to that year, anything change, any big aha release or anything?
I think it's more like we talked about a few minutes ago, is really advancing the digital twin concept to past just the mapping and the monitoring, but actually being responsive. I think that the more that we can reduce the need for humans to actually, I don't think it ever takes humans out of the loop, if you will. It's always going to be, human augmented AI. But the more that we can make the supply chain responsive, so when something does occur, that the supply chain actually tells you how to self-heal back to the whole immune system, I think that's what we're shooting for.
And what we learned, you had started this with those who had suppliers from the Ukraine. Obviously, a conflict in Ukraine impacted it. What I would just leave you with as we look at other conflicts that may occur in the future, we can get ahead of the challenge by knowing our supply chain, using Interos and rely on that and recognize, look what happened in Hong Kong and how many organizations went, wow, as two systems went to one system in Hong Kong. How many businesses went, okay, how do we get out of our real estate there? How do we get out of there? And how do we lose the dependencies? So the service you're doing is absolutely critical to all of us. Thank you for doing it. And thank all of you for being here for this session today. Thank you.
Thank you.